I was minding my own geological research on Kestrel 9. We were trying to terraform it, coaxing atmosphere from boiled rock and ice, when the sky went wrong. Ships dropped out of FTL like bruises on the black. They were not explorers. They were raiders. The Zarthan, a blasted, armored thing of teeth and welds who call their homeworld Carapace. They rained hellfire on our survey camp, shredded the habitat nodes, and turned our comms to static. They killed most of my colleagues in the space of a morning and took 41 of us alive. They put us in cages and loaded us onto a broken freighter. They said nothing that sounded human. Their leader, a thing the prisoners started calling the warlord Garak, smiled with a throat that clicked. I am Dr. Anna Petrescu, geologist once. They would remember that later when they tried to sell us, the race of miners, the race of gardeners, the race of blind philosophers, all of them taken and packed like specimens. From the others in the hold, I learned names and griefs. There were the Lear, glass-skinned ocean scientists with bioluminescent notes tattooed on their wrists. The mech of Suda Prime, small, cordial machine builders who taught me too much about bearings and heat. The soft, slow-syllabled Ruan, who kept saying the word for song and wept for their drowned marshes. They were all peaceful, brilliant, shocked citizens of a sector that had learned to keep its head down whenever the Zarthun cruised through. Communication between cages was a war of time and patience. Our languages could not touch. Our species did not share phonetics, gestures, or scent. But the mech, of course it would be math, had a childlike engineer among them named HX7, who began drawing prime patterns in dust, counting rhythms against the bars. Math is stubborn and universal. Someone took a rock and tapped a sequence. Another answered with a reflected beam. In 3 days, we had hammered out a fractal of meaning, names, the concept of help, the rough numbers of our captors' patrols. They had a device, the Lear whispered. A little radio like a bell? A salvage item the Xarthan had not bothered to crush. The Lear hid it in a false bandage and pinged our coordinates out into the dark. Hope is a small, stupid thing. We knew rescue odds were tiny, but we clung to the ping like drunks to a railing. 3 days after the abduction, 3 Terran frigates dropped out of FTL near Carapace. We saw them like distant constellations through the gill-slit windows of the transport. 2 of the frigates peeled atmosphere and came down with diplomatic lights, white, patient beams across a blood sky. They tried to parley. We heard snippets of voices, words like release and we are not an enemy, drifting faint through bars. Then the Zarthan told us the price of mercy. Their raider guns opened on the diplomats. The 2 Terran landing parties that came down to speak for us were butchered in the field. Human silhouettes torn apart against the charred dunes, and above our cages, the Zarthan hit 2 of the frigates. I saw them explode like iron flowers. The 3rd frigate screamed back toward jump. My gut hitched when she threaded the FTL and vanished. 1 ship escaped. 1 small echo of help retreated with blood on its hull. After that, they took particular pleasure in breaking us. 2 weeks is a long, small torture. The Zarthan understood humiliation. They beat us into submission, into the small, obedient animal that would learn the harness. We were marched through open markets like curiosities. They shaved the Lear's filaments and roasted them for amusement. They strapped the mech to grinders and sold the resulting fragments as agency components to Zarthan artisans who laughed with many mouths. Our food was rind and grit, protein pucks that tasted of engine oil and dried algae that clung to the teeth. Water was rationed in plastic cups. Even that was a negotiation. Night screams were constant. The cages were stacked like lambs in a dark tower. Punishments came for small things. A scratched cage, a word spoken in Terran, a stubborn look. The Zarthan guards, those hulking, plated brutes with horns of repurposed antennae, liked to force us into labor lines, simple excavation for their capital projects, prying out geological seams to feed their foundries. We scraped rock for them that used to be our hope. We were the very hands that rebuilt our tormentors' world. I remember how the mech would sing to themselves in the dark, a rhythm for bearings, and how the Lar wrote sad music on their thighs with a coal from the fire pits. HX7, the small engineer, kept sketching primes on the floor and whispering, "Signal, signal!" It was all we had left. Then, the morning the sky folded with metal, I thought the world had finally given up. At dawn, there was a rumble like 1,000 drums. The horizon lit with a tide of ships, not hundreds, not thousands, legions. Thousands of Terran hulls poured out of FTL in columns that made the sky look stitched with silver. The Zarthan orbital platforms blinked and tried to wake, but the Terran arrival was not a negotiation. No warning, no hail. The Armada hit them like a plague. I cannot describe the sound without tasting copper. Sounds are not enough. The space between planets seemed to shatter. The Terran ships went through the Zarthan orbital defense like knives through paper. I watched missiles track like comets and entire towers fold under plasma like cardboard. Then the Terrans launched pods, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of dark green pods raining down like iron seeds. Each pod opened and spilled Marines who moved with purpose. They were efficient cruelty wrapped in a human face. They plowed the raiders as if the raiders were dust and inconvenience. There was no time for formalities. The Zarthan tried to respond, but their networks were already cut. No one sent a message across their comm channels. They simply could not. The Terran Marines fought like the last thing they would ever do. They were ruthless and not for show. They cut down the guards in lines and used their drop plasma like shears. They pushed forward through the city in synchronized violence, and every time they opened a gate, we could see more mangled armor and more of our cages opened. I remember one squad, callsign Raven 6, battering down a market gate and moving with a kind of terrible choreography. They did not ask questions. They executed as though they had been waiting all their lives for the chance to rip an empire apart for something smaller than victory. Justice. After hours that blurred into an endless blast of light, the Zarthan capital was a ruin. Fires dimpled the horizon, and the air burned with the smell of scorched polymer and bone. The Terran commander who led the ground force, Commander Rourke Hale, a bulky man whose voice had the flat, certain timbre of a man who had forgiven nothing, found us. He came up to the cages, looked at the warlord Garax, who was now knelt, plate split and throat open to fear, and smiled a tired, small smile. "Why?" Garax sobbed. "Why spare them?" "Spare them?" Commander Hale's hands were not steady. There was a silence like a held breath. "So you could keep enslaving? So you could sell more lives? You picked the wrong system, Beast. You learned a lesson." He looked me, not me alone, all of us, and said cold and final, "You will die with one last word in your mind. Humans." He pulled his sidearm. The warlord's bright vocal sacs fluttered uselessly. Then the crack of the barrel and the warlord collapsed into dust and smoke. It was not mercy. It was closure. Commander Hale turned away without a flicker of triumph. He opened the cages, and the first thing the humans did was puke into the dust and then press their faces into each other's shoulders. The lure wrapped themselves in torn tarpaulins and wept with bioluminescent hands. The mech checked their bearings, and HX-7 sat and cried numbers that meant nothing. The surviving Zarthan were rounded up. Those who had tried to flee stared at Carapace with eyes that had not prepared for loss. They watched their burning home, the furnaces they had fed, unmake themselves under the pounding tide of the Terran orbital glass. No one spared them. I do not know if that is a truth to carry or a shame to hide. The Terrans said they would hunt the Zarthan colonies until the last scrap of their naval logistics was gone. Your time to dominate and enslave this part of the galaxy has come to an end. Admiral Kayla Soren announced later, from the deck of her flagship, her voice wired like a blade. "We will erase your species from the history books, and no one will remember what you did." It was a sentence that hung in the air like an accusation and a promise. I do not know how I feel about that. Justice and revenge are cousins who sometimes cannot agree on a bed. We, the 41 and those tens of other species, were gathered and triaged. The Terrans took the humans home with our own kin. The Lyr and Mech and Ruan were given transport to their worlds. HX-7 was assigned an engineer who swore to get him a proper workbench. On the way back, I pressed my palms to the glass viewport for a long, small hour and let the stars fill me. We were alive. That was the first and most ringing fact. And in the evenings when the shakes came, the ones from hunger and the ones from what we had seen, I would think of those plummeting pods and the Marines with their brutal choreography and the moment Commander Hale pulled the trigger. It felt like a wound stitched with bronze, whole, but obvious. When I tell this, and tell it honestly, I do not tell it as a cheer. I tell it as a witness. We were rescued. We were saved by our own kind, by Terran steel and a terrible, uncompromising will. But the Zarthun have been the terror of the sector for generations. They had names we could not translate into law. They had 1,000 years of cruelty behind them. To watch them burn was to see a wound closed with fire and feel the ash of something else on your hand. I am Anna Petrescu. I went to Kestrel 9 to teach a planet how to breathe. I came back with a chest full of knocked teeth and names that will not leave me. HX7's prime drawings, the Liar's half songs, the mech's bearings. We are whole enough to tell it. The Zarthun are broken enough to vanish into rumor. If you ask me what the finale should be, I will only say this. Remember what we did to survive, and remember what we did when we had the power to answer. War does not make saints. It makes stories. This is one of ours.